think there's a learning in actually being out there. Previously, when I went out, if there was like a plastic bottle, I would just be like, oh, some dude threw a plastic bottle. Now I'll pick it up because now it's actually in the place where I get my chanterelles, or I get my wild sorrel, or I get my ramsons. So that is actually that moves my perspective. And I think what happens when you start engaging with nature, not just being in it, but engaging with it, eating it, you start to look at nature in a different way. And what happens is that you start to actually care for both the very concrete local nature just outside your door, but you also start understanding that this richness goes for the more broader perspective and concept of nature. And I think through eating and foraging in nature, you actually fall in love with nature. And if you're in love with something, you have to take care of it. It's just that simple.
Hey folks, I am so stoked that you decided to tune in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Our guest is Mikkel-Lau Mikkelsen, head of the foraging program at MAD, a nonprofit founded by Chef Rene Redzepi of restaurant Noma to inspire and empower the global hospitality industry to create sustainable change and transform food systems for the future. Foraging is something I'm super interested in, but have always been a little hesitant to actually engage in directly. This conversation answered all of my concerns. In the episode, Mikkel-Lau outlines his background growing up in Copenhagen and finding a connection with nature through more of a kitchen-out approach. We discuss how our industrialized food system creates what he calls interfaces that keep us separate from our food, and that foraging can actually enable a direct connection that can influence how we think about the food we consume wherever it comes from. We also talk about the method of foraging and the app that MAD developed that combines both the deep knowledge of some of the best foragers in Denmark with some of the best chefs in Copenhagen to give you a one-stop shop for getting started on your foraging journey. Huge thanks to Mikkel-Lau for taking time to chat. I think his work and the work of MAD more generally is incredibly important, and I am glad he was able to take some time away to share his connection with nature through foraging with us. Make sure to check out our show notes for links on where to download the app. Follow Mikkel-Lau and his foraging activities on social media, and also where to subscribe to MAD's epic email newsletter. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Mikkel-Lau Mikkelsen. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to have Mikkel-Lau Mikkelsen, Program Director of the Foraging Program at MAD. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We always ask our guests the same first question, and so I'll put this forward to you to answer how you see fit. How do you think about your relationship, and how do you define your relationship with nature?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question because it actually goes straight to the core of why I do the work I do. I grew up in the city of Copenhagen, and even though it's not New York, it's still a city. So I lived in the middle of the city for all of my life, and as a kid, the only relationship I had with nature was it was a place you could go for a picnic, or like you would walk in a park, or just that sort of relationship. And I was always very interested in food, and I was always very interested in ingredients. And I worked as a cook for a couple of years, and there was this thing happening where I just saw that the cooks I was looking up to, they were cooking with these ingredients, and I didn't understand where they were getting them. They were just like something I hadn't seen before. And even though I weren't a cook at that point, I was super interested in that. And actually, this was the restaurant Noma and the new Nordic cuisine happening, and that drove me to start looking closer at nature. But it came from the kitchen out. So I was interested in finding ingredients. And the moment that started for me, that also started defining a whole new, very playful approach to nature. The first couple of years, I started this transition of being a non-nature person to being a much more nature person, maybe 10, 12 years ago. And that transition for me started a new relationship. And in the beginning, I would only go out for specific, like for foraging, for getting mushrooms, herbs, just whatever I could find out there. And the excitement was getting it back to the kitchen. But slowly, this actually started a new way for me looking at nature. And once that started a whole new relationship for me, where I actually started to see, and this might sound a little esoteric, but start looking at nature in the more holistic sense, in the way where the rain that is falling when I'm on my bike on my way to work maybe make me happy, because I know that this is something that is part of nature. And I think that shift has gotten me to have a really profound relationship with what's around me. And I use nature now as both like a fun park, like a place to go and kid around and cook and find ingredients, but also as a way of inspiration and finding out new ways of thinking about how society is structured and how food is part of what we do, but also just a place where I sort of reconnect with myself. So it's a very personal relationship I feel I have with nature. And then, of course, through my work, there's a lot of thinking and dissemination about what nature is and can be.
I love that. One of my favorite things is, especially when we get here into the fall in London, I know if it rains, if I go to Epping Forest, which is north of London, all of the mushrooms are going to be out the next morning, and we're not allowed to pick them, so I'm not foraging them, but they're very pretty to look at. So I definitely love that idea of once you start to have this different, more holistic relationship with nature, some of these signs that you maybe didn't really think meant all that much, all of a sudden become much more meaningful in your life. And with that point of meaningful, and you just mentioned your work. So you're the program director for the foraging program at MAD. Maybe for those people who are listening who aren't familiar, can you give us an overview of MAD, kind of where it came from, how it got started, what you all are doing?
So MAD is a nonprofit that was established by the chef and owner of restaurant Noma, Rene Redzepi, with the intention of making a nonprofit that could actually strengthen the people working in hospitality, give them a better way of being professionals, really. And it has also, over the years, transitioned into being a place where we try to take what is coming from all the skill sets and everything that's coming from the hospitality industry and sort of utilize that to change the way people eat in general. So it's actually about engaging with the hospitality community and both giving tools and knowledge and inspiration in that direction, but also sort of helping restaurant chefs to have a bigger impact on the way that we eat as a society.
And you just mentioned restaurants and chefs, and I know MAD's work, especially in your area around foraging, even extends beyond that. There was a video I was watching on YouTube where Rene Redzepi was talking about the launch of the foraging program, and he shared this vision of everyone being a forager from children on up, and how that can help foster this greater connection with the wild and with nature. And we've got this very industrialized food system in a lot of parts of the world. So when you think about foraging, whether that be with children, and I know there's some things that MAD does to reach younger people, but then even going up into the chefs you're working with, which, judging by the MAD Instagram account and some of the folks that I see at some of the events, are chefs that I think a lot of our listeners probably would recognize from their favorite food websites and Instagram accounts. So how do you think about, in that industrialized food system, across sort of the chain of people engaged in it, like what role does wild food and foraging play?
Great question. I always talk about interfaces, because if you think about how we actually interact with food systems, so we interact with the great system that is how food is produced and transported and getting to our plates. That is like the interface on your iPhone. There's a whole system behind it, but the interfaces that we have really as consumers, it's a supermarket, it's a restaurant, and a lot of times you can't see what is behind the product. So when you get a head of lettuce in the supermarket, you can't see the whole process, the whole system behind it. So the interface is really somehow disconnecting you as a consumer from the choices that were made making that head of lettuce. That means that you can't see how was the soil treated, How was the workers treated? How was the transport? All that. So when you forage, you cut that all aside. You are directly out there. You see the impact of time and place, and you understand that the moment that you're picking this, if you're picking wildflowers, you need to think about the fact that this is also part of a food system out there. And I think the way that foraging actually gives us access to something that feels, I always call it the most natural, unnatural behavior for a human being. People are always super scared about getting out there, and it feels very unnatural, but your body is built for this. Like, we were foraging way before we were farming, right? So there is this thing that we have the hardware, we just lack the software to be able to interact with this. And it is, for me, it is, foraging shouldn't be a way to get all your macros and micros and all that stuff. For me, it's a fun way to find flavors that are local, flavors that are different than you could find. And it's a way for us to also interact with nature and food in a super direct way that bypasses a lot of the other industrialized ways of actually looking at food.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense from what you were talking about earlier around your interest in ingredients and how these chefs had these ingredients that were uncovering new flavors for you. And foraging now is this great way for you to make a direct connection there. And one thing you mentioned there was people being a little bit intimidated by foraging. I host this podcast. I love being outside, love being in nature, wild spaces, love the idea of foraged food. If I see it on a menu that's something that's been specifically called out there, I'm really intrigued. I will say, in terms of an individual level, I'm still pretty intimidated by it. I'm afraid I'm going to pick the wrong thing or eat the wrong thing or misidentify something, and feed it to my wife or something like that and make her sick. So how do you think about, as your role in program director, how do you think about getting people started on their foraging journey?
I think what's super important in that question is actually the relationship we have with nature and food. And that is, of course, constructed by the way that we look at the ways that we procure food in general, like food safety, health, all these things. A lot of times when you look at what we perceive as being dangerous or poisonous, things from nature seem either dirty or toxic. And reality is that toxicity is elastic, right? A lot of people think that you eat something, it's like you eat a leaf of something and then that's it, you're dead. That's not how toxicity works. And I think there's a barrier in a lot of people where they're actually scared. It's a new world for them. They're not used to looking at trees as food. They're not used to looking at nature as a way of procuring food. So that's new. But also there's a lot of misconceptions about poison and stuff like that. I'm not saying that people should just go around and eat whatever they find. That's super important. But the way I normally talk about it is that foraging is about methodology. It's a method. And we found this out when we were doing our foraging app, was that we went around with some of the best foragers in Denmark, and we just looked at what they were doing and asked them a bunch of stupid questions like, why are you going there? What are you looking at? Why are you sniffing that? Why are you crunching that? Why are you all of these things? And it turned out that, and this I've learned myself also now being a pretty experienced forager, foraging is about really asking yourself a bunch of questions. Like, time and place is of course the most important part. If you see nature as this great green canvas where you think you can eat everything, you're never going to succeed in learning a lot. So what you do is you ask yourself a bunch of questions, which is, what's the season? Okay. It's spring. Okay, that's good. What's the type of nature I'm going out into? Okay, I'm going to, let's say, the beach. Okay, spring, beach. That's good. We're lucky that nature is super structured. You won't find beach herbs in the forest and you won't find forest herbs on the beach. So we can actually, there's a lot you can actually just lean back and trust. So once you do that, you go from looking at this big canvas, and every time you ask a question, that canvas becomes smaller and smaller. And in the end, you're actually just looking for, let's say, 4 edible things. So what a lot of people do when they start out is that they go out, and if they're with me, they'll ask, is this edible? Is this edible? Is this edible? Is this edible? And a lot of times I'll say, I don't know what it is because I learned from the kitchen out, but I know it's not edible. And I know what I'm looking for. And the better and better you become at it, you just start scanning the landscape. You just like, okay, I see a stream over there. I know it's this season. I know I might find like water mint. And this is actually just from understanding that it's a methodology, and you could actually apply that in any type of nature. You could be put into the, I don't know, jungle. And with the right amount of data, you can still have a good foraging experience. You just need to know that connection between the nature you're in and the plant that you're looking for. This sounds very complex, but in reality, it's just like trying it out with 3 herbs this April. Go out, look for 3 things. One thing that you know that you will find, if you're in England, or for me, I'm in Denmark, stinging nettle will be definitely found out there. It's a delicious ingredient. I love it. It's so versatile. And then go for 2 other ones that you don't know, but you read about them. Find out what nature type, what's the season, how can I mistake this? I'm still learning, right? Mushrooms in particular is something I try to learn between 1 and 3 new mushrooms every year. And then I go deep on those. But that means that I'm bringing out books, I'm bringing out an app, I'm looking online to see, is this the thing? So it's really about reading it before you go out, understanding what type of nature you're going to be in, understanding what season you're in, and then make it super easy. Don't go for a bunch of things, go for 3 things. And for the poison part, it's very, very rare that you can't just taste a little bit of a thing. So what you do when you have to identify a plant is, of course, you look at where you find it. If you're finding what you think is a beach plant in the forest, then it's probably not what you're looking for. But if you're finding it in the right place, you're taking it up, you're looking at it, does it have the identification markers that you want it to have? Some of them you'll be able to identify by smell. There's like a methodology all the time here.
I'll let you pronounce the name of the program and the app, but I will recommend, and kind of leading into my question, the Instagram account for the program has some of these great guides. I was flipping through them in the sort of saved Instagram stories, where it does kind of work you through that methodology quite simply of like, you're in the beach, you're in this season, here are the things to look for. And there's photos, which I think set it up really well. And then there's the app as well, which you just talked about how this was kind of set up from the ground up with some of the best foragers in Denmark. So can you talk a little bit about the app, what it's called, how people can find it, and how that applies sort of the methodology and thinking you just outlined?
Yeah. So the app is called Vild Mad. The spelling is VILDMAD. So it's Danish for wild food. The idea was really to make a tool for people to really carry in their pocket. So when you're out there, you have something that is a tool for you to have support. Because we asked a bunch of people, what would you actually really want in a foraging app? And they said, we don't want a foraging app, we want a foraging person. So we know that we have to sort of download a bunch of foragers into an app. And I think this is what's really special about this app, and it's free for everyone. We've been working with really, really talented chefs, and we've been doing flavor profiles and 130 ingredients with a panel of chefs and foragers where we tasted each herb or each ingredient and talked about how did you cook with this, with some of the people from Noma, some of the people from other restaurants here in Copenhagen. So a very thorough way of going at both the cooking part, the recipes that are in there. We did the same thing when we did the part of the app that helps you in nature. And that's, as I told you, we went out with a bunch of foragers, we talked with biologists. So the idea has been to make an app that can help you in every way, from you're sitting on your couch and you need inspiration for doing something on a Saturday. So you open it and it offers you something you can go and find. And then it is supposed to help you on every step. So there's like, okay, where do I go? Where do I find it? How does it look? What could I mistake it for? Okay, how can I cook it? How should it be cooked? How should it be blanched? How should it be paired? We've tried to take the whole journey of foraging and put that into that app. We've done one that is for the general public, and we've done one for schools because we realized that of course you can't have the same level of knowledge for kids as you can for grown-ups. And so we've done an app that is built to be used in the classroom.
What is the reaction like with the school and classroom app versus maybe a chef or an intrigued home chef who uses the other version of the app? How do children versus adults react differently to this process?
I think for children, they find the foraging part the most exciting. Some paper wrote about the app when it launched that it was like Pokemon Go for nature, because it is this thing where you're just like, okay, I got to find this herb. And then you just like run out into the woods and find a million herbs and find the one, right? And kids just love that, right? It's a purpose. You're not just walking in nature and, oh my, there's an owl. You're actually out there looking for something. And I find that when I take industry people out as a part of how we support the local community here, I do free foraging trips for people from hospitality industry. And they're of course super interested in the ingredient, like what is this? Like how can I cook it? They're just so quick thinking. It's like, okay, this flavor, I could do this with that. I used to live off of doing a lot of foraging trips for a general public. I don't do that anymore. But when I did that, what I saw was that then there'll be, if you're taking 30 people out into the woods, two of them will at some point have this aha moment. They will taste this one thing that might be like a beach herb with the flavor of wild wasabi. And you can just see something flick on for them because that flavor connects them to something. And that is sort of like, aha, if I can find this out here, then what can I not find out here?
To wrap up our conversation here, I want to end with a question sort of about our relationship with nature, because that's where we started. And you just talked about how one of the reviews of the app, talking about especially for children, the app being Pokemon Go for nature. And that sounds to me like a really interesting space when we think about how to create a relationship with nature for young people, sort of from the very earliest days. So we talked a little bit about, to use your analogy, the sort of interface disconnecting people from the actual food sources. Do you think we can sort of, as a society, have a positive relationship with nature if we don't have a positive relationship with our food system?
Of course, the short answer here is no, because I think we lose the sight of the fact that food is nature as well. Even though it's a controlled, cultured piece of nature, it's still nature. And the conception that it is somehow divided from the forest just besides the field or the stream just next to the crops, that's a really short-sighted way of looking at how we actually produce and consume food. I think when you look at the impact that food choices have on nature, it's so evident in a lot of countries that, for example, here where I live, in Denmark, there's very, very little forest left because so much of Denmark we're a really big agricultural nation. And so much of our land mass is being used to produce rye for pigs. And that is really showing us we're losing a lot of nature. I think we're the second lowest per square kilometer in wild nature in Europe. You can just see during pandemic, you could see people rushing out into nature. All of a sudden it was like being in a cramped mall because there's not enough places to go actually. I think this also relates a lot to how we think about food, of course. And to me, I think there's a learning in actually being out there. Previously, when I went out, if there was like a plastic bottle, I would just be like, oh, some dude threw a plastic bottle. Now I'll pick it up because now it's actually in the place where I get my chanterelles or I get my wild sorrel or I get my ramsons. So that is actually, that moves my perspective. And I think what happens when you start engaging with nature, not just being in it, but engaging with it, eating it, you start to look at nature in a different way. And what happens is that you start to actually care for both the very concrete local nature just outside your door, but you also start understanding that this richness goes for the more broader perspective and concept of nature. I can just use my own journey and experience as an outset for this, but I've seen it with a lot of people who comes to me years after they went on a foraging trip with me and said, like, that changed the way I look at these things. And a couple of people I took out, they're now running their own foraging Instagram accounts and stuff like that. So it is a way for us to actually appreciate, because you can't take care of something that you don't really care for. And I think through eating and foraging in nature, you actually fall in love with nature. And if you're in love with something, you have to take care of it. It's just that simple.
Fantastic. What an eye-opening episode and a really great point to end on there. Super inspiring. Thank you so much, Mikkel-Lau, for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you for having me. It's been great.